In the spring of 1803, the most powerful financial institution in the world was not a nation. It did not have an army, a flag, or a vote in any parliament. It had a counting house on Bishopsgate in London, a name older than the American Republic, and a reputation that made kings nervous. Baring Brothers, soon to be joined at the hip with the Amsterdam House of Hope and Company, could move more capital in a season than most European treasuries could raise in a decade. Governments came to it hat in hand. France, bled white by a decade of revolution and war, needed cash it did not have. The United States, barely a generation old, wanted land it could not yet afford. Napoleon Bonaparte sat at the center of it all, first consul of a republic that increasingly resembled an empire, plotting a renewed war against the one country that had never quite bent to him, Great Britain. And in London, the House of Baring had spent more than a decade quietly bankrolling that very war effort, financing British subsidies to allies fighting revolutionary and then Napoleonic France. That was the position Baring Brothers held in 1803, financier to the crown fighting Napoleon. What almost no one outside a handful of private letters knew was that the same firm was about to become financier to Napoleon himself. Within months, one act of finance would double the size of the United States, hand Bonaparte a war chest for the fight to come, and quietly implicate a British bank in arming both sides of the same war. It would be remembered as a triumph of American diplomacy. It was also, underneath, one of the strangest conflicts of interest in the history of money, and almost nobody at the time was allowed to see it whole. On January 30th, 1803, a letter left the Amsterdam offices of Hope and Company addressed to a 30-year-old Baring family son doing business in London. Its author was Pierre César Laboucher, senior partner at Hope's, writing to Alexander Baring about a transaction he called, in his own words, of the utmost magnitude and importance. The letter laid out in careful mercantile hand how two private banking houses might finance a transfer of French territory to the United States, and it proposed something else too. Quietly paying off key officials in both governments to keep the entire deal and its profits inside Baring and Hope's hands alone. That letter still exists, filed in the Baring Archive in London, one draft among hundreds documenting a negotiation almost no history class ever mentions in these terms. It raises an uncomfortable question that the official story of the Louisiana Purchase tends to skip past entirely. Why would a British merchant bank, whose money was, at that very moment, helping arm Britain against France, spend the spring of 1803 quietly arranging to hand Napoleon Bonaparte a fortune? To understand why that letter mattered, you have to understand the numbers strangling both governments in 1803. The United States government spent, across every department, war, navy, and civil administration combined, roughly $7,852,000 that year. That was the entire operating budget of a sovereign nation. Napoleon Bonaparte was asking for $15 million, nearly double the young republic's total annual spending, in exchange for a piece of paper transferring 828,000 square miles of territory nobody in Washington had ever surveyed. There was no American bank capable of raising that kind of money. There was, in truth, barely an American banking system at all. Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin understood this before anyone else in Washington did, which is exactly why the deal was never going to be financed in Philadelphia or New York. It would be financed in London and Amsterdam by houses most Americans had never heard of and would never meet. Napoleon's opening price was worse than $15 million. He first asked for 100 million French francs, a figure that would have killed the deal outright and that even his own finance minister considered unrealistic. It took the direct intervention of Alexander Baring and his Hope and Company counterpart, Pierre César Laboucher, sitting across the table in Paris alongside the American ministers, to talk the French government down to 80 million francs, the equivalent of $15 million at the exchange rates then in use. Gallatin then split that sum into two very different instruments. $3,750,000 would never leave American hands at all. It would cover long-standing French debts to American merchants, spoliation claims for ships and cargo seized during years of undeclared naval conflict, the United States essentially forgiving France's own IOUs to American citizens as part of the purchase price. The remaining $11,250,000 would be raised the only way it could be, through government bonds paying 6% annual interest, payable twice a year in Amsterdam, London, or Paris, not due to mature for 15 to 20 years. These were the first United States government securities ever sold on an international capital market. A brand new country with no credit history to speak of was about to ask European investors to trust its paper for 2 decades. Gallatin was so anxious about the physical mechanics of the deal that he had the bond certificates copied and shipped across the Atlantic in triplicate, on separate vessels, simply so that the loss of any single ship to storm or seizure would not unravel the entire transaction. That is the kind of detail that rarely survives into the textbook version of the story, a Treasury secretary hedging against shipwreck, because there was no other way to move a $15 million transaction across an ocean in 1803. Here is where the deal turns from diplomacy into pure financial engineering and where the numbers get uncomfortable. Napoleon did not want bonds maturing in 1819. He wanted cash in 1803 immediately to fund a war he already suspected was coming. So Baring Brothers and Hope and Company agreed to do something extraordinary. They would buy the American bonds directly from the French government, in full, at a discount of roughly 12.5%, paying something close to 87.5 cents on every dollar of face value, and then resell those bonds gradually to investors across London and Amsterdam at their own risk and for their own profit. France received a portion of its payment in gold within the first month, with the balance arriving in monthly installments of close to 2 million francs month after month until the account was fully settled. Sir Francis Baring, watching the scale of his firm's exposure from London, wrote to his Amsterdam counterparts a line that survives in the archive precisely because it captures the vertigo of the moment. "We all tremble at the magnitude of the American account." He was not exaggerating. Barings alone carried 60% of the risk on paper that had never existed in any market before. Hope and Company carried the remaining 40%. If the bonds failed to sell, if the young United States defaulted, if renewed war disrupted the shipping lanes between Amsterdam and Washington, 2 private banking families stood to absorb losses that could have ruined them both. They didn't fail, the bonds sold. Investors across the Netherlands and Britain, hungry for 6% yields backed by a sovereign government however new and untested, bought in steadily through 1803 and 1804. Barings and Hope walked away with a clean profit on the discount alone, something in the range of 12.5% gross on $11.25 million of paper, without ever laying claim to an acre of the land itself. Napoleon got his cash for the war he wanted. Jefferson got a continent for less than 3 cents an acre, and 2 private banking houses, operating almost entirely outside public view, had just executed the largest peacetime land transaction in human history using money that belonged to neither government. None of this happens without one specific man, and his path to that negotiating table in Paris says as much about the deal as the numbers do. Alexander Baring was born in London in 1774, the second son of Sir Francis Baring, and from childhood he was groomed for the family trade rather than any gentleman's profession or military commission. His elder brother went into the East India Company. Alexander was sent to learn merchant banking from the inside, the hard way, at a desk. In 1794, at 20, his father dispatched him to Amsterdam to apprentice at Hope and Company, the very firm that would later become Baring's partner in the Louisiana financing, and the firm that quietly trained him in exactly the kind of cross-border bond arbitrage he would later deploy against France. A year after that came the assignment that would define the rest of his life. Francis Baring sent his son across the Atlantic to negotiate the purchase of land in Maine from William Bingham, a Pennsylvania senator widely considered at the time the richest man in America. Alexander stayed in the country for 6 years. In 1798, at Bingham's Philadelphia estate, he married the senator's eldest daughter, Anne Louisa. It was, by every surviving account, a match built as much on capital as on affection. The marriage tied one of London's most powerful banking families directly into the American commercial elite, giving Alexander Baring something no rival financier in Europe possessed: blood ties, personal friendships, and first-hand lived knowledge of the American merchant class, gained by residing among them for the better part of a decade. By the time the Louisiana negotiations opened in 1803, Baring was not simply a competent banker sent to broker a foreign deal. He was, in the truest sense, family to the country he was financing, trusted in Whitehall as a Baring, and trusted in Washington and Philadelphia as Bingham's son-in-law. That dual identity is precisely why the French, the Americans, and his own father were all willing to hand him effective control of a $15 million transaction at the age of 28. It is worth sitting with how unusual that was. Most of the men shaping the fate of nations in 1803 had been elected, appointed, or born into a title. Alexander Bering had none of those credentials. What he had instead was a marriage certificate and a decade of dinner-table access to the people who actually ran American commerce and in the world of international finance that turned out to be worth more than any ambassadorship. Picture the room in Paris in April of 1803. On one side sit Robert Livingston, the American minister to France, and James Monroe, freshly arrived from Washington with instructions that were already obsolete before he'd finished unpacking. Across from them sits François Barbé-Marbois, Napoleon's finance minister, a man who had lived in America for years and, unlike most of Napoleon's court, genuinely liked the place. And beside the French and American principals present at nearly every session sit Alexander Bering and Pierre César Laboucher, bankers, not diplomats, with no official standing in either government, yet somehow indispensable to both. The opening move belonged to Talleyrand, France's foreign minister, who had personally opposed selling Louisiana at all. On April 11th, according to Livingston's own dispatch to Secretary of State Madison, Talleyrand asked almost casually whether the Americans might be interested in more than just New Orleans. Livingston answered that American interest extended only to New Orleans and the Floridas. Talleyrand pressed further. If France gave up New Orleans, he said, the rest of Louisiana would be of little value to her anyway, so what, he wanted to know, would the Americans give for the whole territory? Livingston was, by his own account, astonished. The day before, Napoleon himself had already made the decision in private, telling Barbé-Marbois with characteristic finality, "I renounce Louisiana. It is not only New Orleans that I will cede, it is the whole colony without any reservation." What followed was less a negotiation over whether to sell than a negotiation over price, and that is where Bering and Laboucher did their real work, pressing the French demand for 100 million francs down to 80 million, a figure the American side could plausibly finance and Napoleon's ministers could accept without losing face in front of their own emperor. When the treaty was finally signed at the end of April, Livingston reportedly turned to the others in the room and said, "We have lived long, but this is the noblest work of our whole lives. From this day, the United States take their place among the powers of the first rank." He was not wrong about the significance. He may not have fully grasped in that moment exactly whose money had just made it possible, or what that money was about to be used for next. To understand why Napoleon was willing to give up an entire continent for 80 million francs, you have to leave Paris entirely and travel to a Caribbean island that almost none of the American negotiators ever once mentioned in their letters home. Saint-Domingue, the French colony that is now Haiti, had been, for most of the 18th century, the single most profitable colony on Earth, producing more sugar and coffee than anywhere else in the world on the backs of roughly 500,000 enslaved people. In 1791, those enslaved people rose up in the largest and most successful slave revolt in recorded history, led over the following decade by the formidable Toussaint Louverture, a self-taught military and political strategist who would eventually govern the colony in all but name, negotiating with European powers as something close to an equal. Napoleon could not accept a black-led republic thriving in what he still considered French sovereign territory. In late 1801, he dispatched his own brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, with tens of thousands of French troops in secret orders to restore both French rule and, eventually, slavery itself. It was meant to be quick and decisive. It was neither. Louverture's forces, and later his successors, fought a brutal and relentless campaign of resistance, and the Caribbean climate did what French bayonets could not. Yellow fever tore through Leclerc's army with a mercilessness no general could plan around or requisition his way out of. By the end of 1803, somewhere near 55,000 French soldiers were dead, the overwhelming majority from disease rather than combat. Leclerc himself died of the fever that September, months before the Louisiana Treaty was even ratified. Louverture was eventually captured through a betrayal disguised as a peace negotiation, shipped to France in chains and left to die of cold and neglect in a mountain prison in the Jura, but the rebellion he built outlived him. Haiti would declare its independence in January of 1804, the second republic in the Western Hemisphere and the first born of a successful slave revolution anywhere in the world. For Napoleon, the practical consequence arrived months earlier, and it was brutal in its simplicity. Louisiana had only ever mattered to him as a breadbasket and staging ground meant to resupply Saint-Domingue's sugar economy. Without the Caribbean colony, mainland Louisiana was, in his own cold calculation, a liability rather than an asset, an undefended territory that a resurgent British Navy could simply seize for free the moment hostilities resumed. A slave revolt on a small Caribbean island, thousands of miles from Paris and even farther from the Mississippi, had just quietly decided the fate of the entire American interior, before Alexander Bering ever sat down at that negotiating table, and before a single liver of Bering or Hope money had moved. Here is where the story most textbooks tell: brilliant American diplomacy seizes a continent through sheer Jeffersonian foresight, starts to look considerably less tidy. Napoleon did not sell Louisiana because he respected the fledgling American Republic, or because he suddenly discovered a taste for continental expansion by proxy. He sold it because Haiti had bled France of tens of thousands of soldiers and any remaining appetite for a North American empire, and because he needed cash immediately for the one war that actually mattered to him. The resumption of hostilities with Great Britain, which he fully expected, correctly as it turned out, to erupt again within weeks. The fragile Treaty of Amiens, the uneasy peace between Britain and France, collapsed formally in May of 1803, barely a month after the Louisiana Treaty was signed in Paris. Napoleon spent a significant share of the proceeds from that sale preparing for exactly that war. And this is the detail that rarely survives the retelling. The bank making that cash available to him, discounting his bonds, wiring gold to Paris, structuring the entire transaction from end to end, was Baring Brothers, a British merchant house that had spent the previous decade as one of the Crown's principal financiers of the war against revolutionary and then Napoleonic France. Sir Francis Baring had personally helped fund British subsidies to European coalition partners fighting Bonaparte on land. His own son was now, simultaneously, helping fund Bonaparte's war chest against Britain, using an American land deal as the mechanism to launder the difference. It did not go unnoticed for long. British officials grew increasingly uneasy as 1803 wore on and war with France resumed in earnest. Francis Baring was summoned by the government to account for the firm's role, forced to lay out in detail exactly how much French money had passed through Baring and Hope's hands and where it had gone. The explanation apparently satisfied the ministers enough to avoid outright public scandal, but not enough to let the arrangement continue unchecked. By November of 1803, with Britain and France now formally at war again, the government ordered Baring to stop remitting any further funds to Paris. The house that had spent a decade helping arm Britain against Napoleon had, for several crucial months in the middle of that same war, also been quietly arming Napoleon against Britain, not out of loyalty to France and certainly not out of ideology, but because a $15 million American land deal happened to run directly through the one financial pipeline capable of executing it. Money, it turns out, does not observe the same borders that soldiers do. It never has. The consequences of that spring in Paris rippled outward for over a century, and they did not fall evenly on everyone involved. For the United States, the arithmetic looks almost absurdly generous in hindsight. 828,000 square miles, doubling the size of the country overnight, for a final price that worked out to less than 3 cents an acre. 13 future states, in whole or in part, would eventually rise on that land, from Louisiana itself up through the plains to Montana and the Dakotas. Lewis and Clark set out to survey it within a year of the ink drying, mapping a territory the government that had just bought it did not remotely understand yet. But the number that gets quoted in every classroom, $15 million, obscures a harder truth sitting underneath it. That land was not empty. It was home to dozens of native nations, none of whom were party to the negotiation in Paris, none of whom received a cent of the $15 million, and all of whom would spend the following decades absorbing wave after wave of American settlement, broken treaties, and outright forced removal. As the country made good on the paper transaction, Livingston and Monroe had signed thousands of miles from their homelands. The purchase also extended, geographically and politically, the machinery of plantation slavery deep into the American interior, a fault line that widened for 6 decades until it split the country apart in civil war. Jefferson himself, a man who had spent his career arguing for strict limits on federal power, spent the summer of 1803 privately agonizing over whether the Constitution even permitted him to make the purchase at all, a contradiction he ultimately resolved by simply proceeding and asking Congress to ratify the fact after it was already done. For Napoleon, the money bought time, not victory. It helped finance the opening campaigns of a war that would eventually consume most of a decade and end with his empire dismantled, and Napoleon himself in exile on a rock in the South Atlantic. Haiti, having paid the highest price of anyone in the story in blood, declared independence in January of 1804, and then spent the next century paying for that independence in a different currency entirely, coerced by France in 1825 into an enormous indemnity, paid at gunpoint under threat of renewed invasion, that drained the new nation's finances for generations. Historians still argue about how much of Haiti's later poverty traces directly back to that forced debt. It is, at minimum, an uncomfortable footnote to a story usually told as an unambiguous American triumph. And Baring Brothers, the firm that quietly financed both a continent's expansion and an emperor's war chest in the same season, went on to become, for the better part of 2 centuries, one of the most trusted names in international finance, so dominant a few years later that a French prime minister would joke there were 6 great powers in Europe: England, France, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Baring Brothers. The firm survived the rest of the Napoleonic Wars, the collapse of Napoleon's empire, a near-catastrophic crisis of its own in 1890 that the Bank of England had to personally organize a rescue for, and continued advising governments and underwriting sovereign debt across the world for another century after that. It did not survive the 20th century's end. In 1995, a single derivatives trader in a Singapore office, working almost entirely unsupervised, ran up losses that bankrupted the 233-year-old institution in a matter of weeks, forcing its sale for the nominal sum of £1. The bank that once helped decide the fate of a continent, and quietly financed opposite sides of a European war without most of the continent noticing for months, collapsed in the end not from some grand conspiracy or a hostile government, but from one junior employee, a set of hidden trading accounts, and a level of internal oversight that nobody with real authority thought to apply until it was too late. There's a lesson buried in that ending. We'll come back to it in a moment. Now, I want to be careful here, because it would be easy to walk away from this story thinking Baring Brothers secretly engineered the map of North America for private profit, or that some shadowy cabal of merchant bankers manipulated Napoleon into selling against his own better interests. That is not what the historical record actually supports. Napoleon made his decision to sell for reasons that were substantially his own: the military catastrophe in Saint-Domingue, the near certainty of renewed war with Britain, and a cold calculation that an undefended American colony was worth more to him as liquid cash than as territory he could not realistically hold. Historian Larry Neal, who has spent years working directly through the Baring Archive's original correspondence for his research on the purchase's financing, describes the arrangement not as a scheme cooked up by the bankers to seize control of events from the outside, but as a genuinely collaborative and genuinely uncertain response to a transaction so large that no single government or institution could execute it alone. Albert Gallatin's structuring of the American bonds was sound, conventional public finance for the era, not some backroom trick designed to obscure anything. Jefferson's constitutional anxiety was real and well documented in his own letters, not political theater performed for later historians. And the timing of Haiti's revolution relative to the Louisiana sale, while historically decisive, was not something any banker in London or Amsterdam orchestrated from a distance. It was simply the accident of history that a private financial negotiation in Paris happened to land in the same narrow window as a colonial collapse unfolding an ocean away in the Caribbean. What makes this story worth telling isn't a conspiracy. It's something a little more uncomfortable than that. A reminder that the largest decisions in a nation's history are frequently executed through entirely mundane, self-interested financial machinery: bond discounts, exchange rates, risk-sharing percentages quietly negotiated between 2 merchant families, rather than through the grand ideological narratives we tend to remember them by afterward. None of that makes the story less consequential. It just makes it less comfortable, which is usually the more accurate version of how history actually happens. Strip away the muskets and the treaties, and the Louisiana Purchase was, underneath everything else, a story about who actually held the pen in 1803. It wasn't only Jefferson or Napoleon or the ministers who put their signatures on the treaty. It was 2 private banking families in London and Amsterdam, one of them related by marriage to the very country it was financing, quietly deciding how much risk they were willing to carry and at what discount they were willing to carry it. Governments declared wars and drew borders on maps. Bankers decided whether either could actually happen in practice. that arrangement has never really gone away. It has only gotten better in the 2 centuries since at staying out of the history books entirely. Every major geopolitical shift since 1803, from wars to annexations to the quiet financial engineering sitting behind them, has run through some version of that same private ledger logic. Someone somewhere has to actually front the cash, and whoever that someone turns out to be ends up holding a kind of leverage that no election will ever grant them and no treaty will ever fully record. The unsettling part isn't that Baring Brothers profited from financing both a continent's expansion and an emperor's war chest in the very same season. It's that almost nobody at the time, and almost nobody since, thought to ask out loud how comfortable that arrangement really was. Power, it turns out, rarely announces itself with a flag or a speech. More often, it just quietly settles the account, collects its discount, and lets everyone else spend the next 2 centuries arguing about what happened in the treaty room. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the kind that follows the money instead of the flag, drop the word ledger in the comments and tell me which financial house you want investigated next. And if you want the next one delivered the moment it's ready, the subscribe button is sitting right there below this video. Napoleon Bonaparte trusted a British bank's paper more than he trusted the American government's own signature, at the exact moment that bank's home country was preparing to go back to war with him. That should tell you something about where the real power sat in 1803. It may tell you something about where it still sits today.